Hello, and welcome to Wallace's Mysteries of Antiquity. Subscribe to this channel to join me in exploring the enigmas of our distant ancestors and try to come to tentative conclusions about them. This video will be examining what I believe was intended to be Snefru's final resting place, the Bent Pyramid at Dashur. I've already gone over Snefru's other pyramids, and this video will wrap up his rule for now. I will quickly go over some background, then some theories, then give you a tour and discuss the mysteries within and around every corner. You can see the length of this video, so settle in. Snefru was a very powerful ruler. His consolidation of power and the conquest of surrounding regions like Nubia and Libya provided Egypt with huge amounts of resources like gold, diorite, and copper mines, and also massive amounts of conscripted manpower. It was written that he built a fleet of 40 transport ships purely for the importing of cedar from Lebanon, which explains the sudden appearance of lots of cedar in his structures. All of this is recorded on what's called the Palmyra stone in the 5th dynasty, shown here on screen. There is a valley temple along a causeway to the northeast of the pyramid. This statue of Snefru himself was found in this temple by Fakre in the 1950s. On the east side, there is a small temple. You'd likely enter the small building through the door on the east, then enter the courtyard in front of the two stela and place your offering. This temple appears to currently be in even better state than when the Asita project was there, and you can walk around it now at your leisure. Apart from a handful of people who had permission to explore the pyramid, for most of modern times, it was off limits, just like the Red Pyramid. This is due to its location next to a military base, which has helped protect it until 2019 when it was open for tourists. Trespassers will risk arrest to climb to the top of the Great Pyramid. Bullets not so much. Though it's not exactly fenced in, there was just a checkpoint, which I imagine was susceptible to the occasional bribe. From the Bent Pyramid, the Red Pyramid is visible nearby, within walking distance for a healthy adult. You can see it in the background of the image on the left. The ruined Black Pyramid of the Middle Kingdom is also right nearby, and you can see in the right image. There are two unique features of this pyramid that make it visually striking. The first is that unlike most pyramids, most of the smooth casing stones remain in place to this day. There are more of them in the lower courses than the upper ones, and this may be due to how they were laid. Lower courses had their casing stones angled inwards slightly, where upper casing stones were laid flat. An interesting counter-argument against the narrative that the Bent Pyramid was rejected by Snefru is that the casing stones of both it and its satellite pyramid were continually patched, and there is evidence of a cult presence around it for almost 1,000 years. History for Granite is currently in the process of mapping these casing stones, so I won't be looking at them in detail here. If he discovers anything interesting, I can assume we'll get a video from him about it. Most of the modern scaffolding was added by a German consultant working with the Time Scanners project in 1992 after the Cairo earthquake, which had its epicenter right next to this pyramid. The second unique feature of this pyramid is the obvious change in angle halfway up the structure. It is largely believed that this was due to structural failures as they were showing themselves during construction. However, more recently, that narrative is being challenged. Personally, I'm leaning towards this not being the intended design, but also not exactly being a failure in the common sense. I think the nearly 60-degree angle we see on the lower part of the pyramid was not meant to be the outer edge. I think we're looking at the side of a step like the structure the Meidum Pyramid was built with. In that case, they'd built a stepped pyramid and continually encased it with larger and larger rings. Then, after this concretion, a final smoothing layer was added. I think that was intended for this pyramid as well, sort of like the image on the right, though I don't believe the top was ever flat. I think several onion layers of pyramid exist underneath what we see, and I'll show you joints in the passageway once we get inside to reinforce that. The pyramid has a convex shape. It was likely built with flat faces, but outward pressure from heat caused parts of it to swell and give it a puffy appearance. This thermal expansion has caused some deep cracks in the outer masonry, but it's unclear whether the Egyptians would have considered this a problem or not, as the Red Pyramid, which most people consider to be nearly perfect, also has deep masonry cracks that extend to the casings. The entrance is on the north side, like most pyramids, and is fairly low to the ground, only 11 meters above the desert floor. This one is original, so it gives us a unique look at how the pyramid entrance was originally built. A convenient bit of casing stone was left by looters to facilitate continuous access. In modern times, a staircase has been constructed at its base. If the angle of the top of the pyramid had been continued all the way down like I believe it was intended to, this entranceway would have been elevated to about the location of the Great Pyramid's entrance. Like most pyramids, there is a notch beyond the door that seems to have been for a wooden doorway, and no effort has been made to conceal the entrance, as it's advertised by a giant two-course lintel above it, and two stones surrounding it are angled towards the door. History for granite called this slippage, but I think he's mistaken. It appears to be intentional considering the symmetry and the lack of evidence for slipping around it. I know you watch my channel, so just a reminder that this is just a peer review process and I don't want anyone to feel called out. I pointed out a mistake ancient architects made in his satellite pyramid video, one Keith Hamilton made in his Layman's Guide to Meidum. We'll actually circle back to that. And I made an error in my G3B video. It happens, which is why it's important to have multiple sources for everything. You will see some significant slippage in the passageway. It's possible that the underlaying bedrock was to blame for this. Unlike Giza, which is made of ancient limestone, Darshur's bedrock is made of young sandstone and clay, and therefore it will settle much more than a base made of limestone. Though, when the German team that reinforced the casing stones did a full survey, they found absolutely no evidence that the outer shell had settled at all, indicating that all core movement happened during construction before the final layer. Now we'll head inside where the real mysteries lie. The floor of the downward passage has been removed for the first few meters, but a wooden staircase has been placed down since this photo was taken in 1997. Along this passageway, we can see three distinct building phases, separated by joints. Between E1 and E2, or 12.6 meters down, there is the biggest reason people point to the Bent Pyramid being a failure. There is a massive crack where the outer layer has sunk nearly a foot. On the left side of the passageway, you can see where someone had chiseled 3 centimeters away from the ceiling, indicating this slip was far less noticeable in the past. Looking up the passage at this stone, you can see how far it's really slipped. I wonder how many people have hit their head here over the thousands of years we have been climbing around inside. There also seems to be a sort of excavation to both sides, perhaps to try and remove the falling stone. You can see the smooth face of the different building phase here too, and its angle is slightly shallower than the outer layer. On the left side, you can see how deep this crack really goes, as well as the angle of the masonry here. This is a long passageway, taking you to 23 meters underground. It starts out very square and well preserved, and there is a modern staircase to assist in what many people describe as the hardest pyramid to navigate. As you get closer to the bottom, the passageway starts to get rounded out, looking similar to the destruction wrought by salt in the Meidum Pyramid. At the bottom of the long downward passage, there is a pit in the floor. Almost all pyramids have a small pit in the bottom of their passageways, most likely as a place to catch rainwater and debris. This is covered by a wooden floor today, but in 1997, Andrew Bayek had to climb over these planks to get into what's called the antechamber. Although it's hardly even a room, it's more of an extension of the corridor where the ceiling suddenly rises above you. This is a very confusing space. Notice how rough the walls are below the corbelling. It was found that the Meidum Pyramid has corbelled space above both its antechamber's flat ceiling and above its downward passage. I wonder if there may have been a ceiling here once, as well as if there is an inclined corbelled space behind that wall, though it does appear to be bedrock. When John Shea Paring explored this pyramid in 1839, He found loose stone had been mortared together to create a makeshift staircase leading to the first chamber. You can see it in the diagram that he drew here. The outline of an ancient staircase can be seen along both walls and, interestingly, would meet the lower section about 2 meters above the floor, although what Perring found seemed to have been mortared together rubble. Today, this antechamber is ascended via a tight staircase. The walls of the antechamber appear to be lined with thin paving stones, and bedrock can be seen where pieces have fallen away. It's unclear whether or not the descending passage is cut through the bedrock like a tunnel or created in a trench. What seems clear is that the corbels are sitting directly on bedrock. I found a paper stating that most of it is a tunnel, but it's not clear to me what they are basing this off of. At the very end of the antechamber, at the bottom, there is a robber's probe into the bedrock, but they stopped after only a few feet. Unfortunately, if you peek behind the modern stairs, the excavation is not visible, but you can see some rubble. I'm not sure if this is part of the original rubble pile that Perring found here, or if it was pulled from the upper sections by Hussein in 1947. Looking up from the bottom, you get an idea of how unnaturally tall this space really is, and you can see the tall doorway to the lower chamber. The entrance from the antechamber into the lower room shows us further that we can't assume that what we see now is original. The doorway has clearly changed shape at least once, having a rounded top now, but also notice how the corbels from the ceiling actually jut out past the door, indicating that the door was once much shorter, making me further think that the corbel ceiling wasn't originally visible. Looking closely, we can see that the corbels have a variety of logs as well as holes where logs no longer are. I presume these logs were put there to aid in raising something from the bottom before the staircase was built. In the lower chamber, things start to get weird. Firstly, look at Perring's drawing on the right. It seems the entire floor of the lower chamber was once covered in debris, because Perring thought that he was standing on several meters of debris and that the floor was level with the antechamber. This is not the case. The floor is located just a few inches below where the debris was. Remember the outline of the staircase I mentioned that must have preceded the rough masonry pile? Strangely, it does not lead to the floor. If one were to follow it, it'd enter the lower chamber about 2 meters high, in line with what's known as the window. If you extend this line even further, it will intersect with the connection tunnel to the upper section, so it's not even clear where this staircase was going. The amount of debris found by Perring is not even close to what's needed to add 2 meters to the floor or to create a staircase to the top. The lower chamber is rectangular and has one of the most beautiful ceilings, corbelled on all 4 sides. Unfortunately, in order to access the upper sections, a massive scaffolding and staircase exist in this space today. But here you can see the ceiling unobstructed in the London Illustrated from March 22, 1947. It also connects to a strange vertical but dead-end shaft called the Chimney, for which its purpose remains mysterious. In the entranceway to the chimney, below the floor is a shaft. You can see the start of the excavation for it here in 1947. I've seen conflicting reports to its depth. Fakhri said he dug 8 meters and had yet to reach the bottom, but another report I found said that the bottom is just 18 feet down, where burnt incense was found. It seems a modern exploration is in order. This shaft is strange and very unique. In the image, you can see where the floor has been pulled up, and look what's underneath. That's the local bedrock, indicating that there is nothing underneath the floor. But it's a trick. There's a deep, well-smoothed shaft which was filled with sand underneath that bedrock. The Egyptians had cut local stones and placed them here on purpose, so that if robbers dug up the floor, they would think there was nothing there. Very clever, but why? Why would they go to this extent to hide a shaft to nowhere? Inside the chimney, I have a minor mystery. The image on the right was taken in 1947, and the one on the left almost exactly 50 years later. Where did all that crap come from? My assumption is that the picture on the right was taken before Hussein began extracting the masonry chips from the upper section, and some of them ended up being thrown in the chimney instead of being pulled out. In this newspaper clipping, you can see the amount of material that was being pulled out of the pyramid being piled up near the entrance. It's likely they were moving material from the upper section to the lower section, then from the lower section to outside. Hussein tragically passed during excavation. I assume after he passed, work stopped and the stones temporarily stored in the lower chamber were swept into the chimney. Speaking of the chimney, it's a quite strange structure. It's nearly as tall as a chamber, but not quite, and had two false doors embedded in the sides. The top of the doorway is not in line with the ceiling of the passageway. Perhaps this entire section was meant to be walled off. There is a keyhole access above the passage called the window, but in my opinion, it's just a relieving space. Based on what we know about Meidum, the Egyptians seem to put relieving chambers over any empty space. Of course, this begs the question, why not just corbel the doorway? Inside, the chimney shoots up towards the surface. It's not square, but longer in the north-south direction. I had rejected the Meidum upper chamber as a burial chamber because you'd be forced to tip the body vertically to get it up the shaft. A coffin could be raised up this shaft with minimal tipping, though it does get tighter at the top. It doesn't go anywhere, but perhaps it was intended to meet the upper chamber, but it may have also been entirely dummy architecture. I believe the two doors are definitely dummy architecture, but I think there might be just to decorate a necessary building feature. This is the exact center of the pyramid, and I think a plumb line was hung down it in order to center everything. When it was no longer needed, they simply blocked it off with two large flush blocks. Ironically, when I rejected Keith Hamilton's portcullis design for the Meidum pyramid as impractical, I proposed a two-block portcullis instead that would have looked exactly like this from below. But Scan Pyramids took a muograph inside the pyramid and showed us there is no large hidden spaces inside. One of the many things that makes the Bent Pyramid so weird is the fact that it has two completely separate chamber systems that were connected via a rough-cut tunnel. The access to this tunnel is near the very top of the lower chamber in the corbels. Today, there is an obtrusive scaffolding and staircase, but in 1997, this rickety, vertigo-inducing ladder was the only way in. At first, the tunnel is fairly square and flat, but it will rapidly elevate and decline in quality. The photograph on the left is the entrance, and the one on the right is from inside the tunnel looking back. You can see the scaffolding if you look closely. It looks like some paving stones may have been inserted to make it look nice, but some have fallen off, revealed that the lower part of the tunnel is still below the bedrock. There is a gentle bend in the passage, likely to prevent falling stones from accelerating too much. The passage also gets steeper here, as well as thinner. You might assume this is a log inserted to aid climbing, but it's actually carved directly out of stone. At the top of the rough passage, this is what you will see. You will enter another passage running perpendicular about a foot below its floor. Right here, it looks like there may have once been a floor within the rough tunnel as well. This part seems cut directly into the stone. If you head left, you'll enter the upper chamber system, but at first we're going to check out what's to the right, which is the western passage. Directly west of the tunnel, pairing marks a place where the floor has been removed and records 3 squared holes in the wall before a portcullis. This is strange. Notice how the part where he says the floor is removed is directly underneath the easternmost square hole. This is what that space looked like in 1947. You can clearly see all square holes and the load of debris on the floor, but no indication that the floor has been dug up. In fact, it doesn't seem possible for the floor to have been removed. Fakhri specifically mentions that he removed the floor here. Furthermore, directly under the floor is this. If there was no floor there, Paring should have seen this pit, so I have no idea what he saw. This pit has a grooved western side, which may have been used to slide ropes, and we can assume the square holes had the same purpose. The bottom of the pit is the bedrock, but the pit in the lower chamber has me questioning. Could this be fake bedrock as well? It's quite a few meters higher than where we know the bedrock starts in the connecting tunnel, so there could be plenty of room for something hidden underneath, though there is no reason to assume that the bedrock would be level throughout. These are squared, smooth blocks within, so it is clearly an original feature. Its purpose is a mystery, however, I have a theory. Large burial goods, like Snefru's sarcophagus, wouldn't fit through the tunnels. Therefore, it must be placed inside the pyramid during construction. There appears to have been a lot of work being done in the burial chamber, so this shaft seems like a convenient place to store it until needed. Strangely, the yellow limestone used for the wall is used nowhere else in this pyramid, making me think it might have been there before. The next thing you'll run into is a massive portcullis. The Asita project photographer had to stand on these sketchy planks, but a modern secure floor is in place today, as well as a wooden structure preventing access to the upper section. You can see how it works in this diagram. The stone would sit in the upper position until it was ready to be closed. Then it would slide transversely to close the passage. There is also a relieving corbel above it, as well as a backing stone. The place where the portcullis was stored is now full of trash. These logs probably came from the upper section. You can see the backing stone above, and I believe it was used to create a pivot point to lift the portcullis slightly to get it started sliding, as it would not do so on its own. Continuing west, through the portcullis, just before we go up the passage, there's yet another pit in the floor. I'm not sure if the bottom of this pit has been reached or not, but I assume it's the same depth as the one next to it. Normally, I'd associate any pit at the end of a downward passage's purpose to be to catch rain. I still think that's this one's purpose too, but strangely the pit does not span the entire corridor like the big one does. You can barely see it under the board here, so a paving stone likely covered it. Perhaps a crack was left to drain water. Now ascending the western corridor, there is a section of the floor that is lower than the rest. It's not entirely clear if this is pulled up or if this was intentional, because there are two holes for logs on either side that span the entire height. I have a question about this picture taken of the space in 1997. Why are there a bunch of hats here? Are those from the workers who unplugged the tunnel in 1947? Why did they leave them there? When Perring explored this space, he found it entirely filled with chunks of stone. These had come from the plug stones that blocked the upper part of the tunnel. It's unclear how far down the plugs originally went, but the yellow block in Hamilton's diagram shows where Perring found the first block intact, about where this picture is looking down was taken from. You can see bits of stone laying around in the upper passage in this diagram by Perring, but you'll also notice a piece of stone still in situ. When removed, a small hole in the wall was discovered, and embedded in the mortar was this 20-inch coffin containing a bat. I've read in multiple places that it was found where the floor was dug up, but the picture clearly shows it in a wall. It's likely invasive from the 26th dynasty, and I've read that a crudely drawn lion was found near it, but I can't find where that is. The fact that the corridor was totally plugged is interesting, as we normally only think of entrances of pyramids being plugged. Mastabas had fully plugged passageways, but not pyramids, at least not according to conventional wisdom. I've read there is Arabic graffiti above the entranceway. I assume this was put there by Fakhri's workers to commemorate Ompana, which was not an uncommon thing to do at the time. The plugs also preserved the wall of the corridors perfectly, showing us what all pyramid passages likely originally looked like. These are some of the most pristine walls in Egypt. Look at how shiny it is where the light hits. It also shows us that at least for the western entrance, the strategy of sealing it by plugging worked. No one had found the second entrance until Perring went looking for it. He was able to spot it fairly easily from the desert, but he had several advantages over historical people. Mainly, he had surveyed the inside and knew more or less where to look. Secondly, as a surveyor, he likely had a spyglass, which was a technology that wasn't invented until the 1600s. If we backtrack back to the rough tunnel leading to the upper section, in the diagram we notice we're actually between two portcullis mechanisms. And if we go left, We see one that was never closed, currently being propped up by a wooden beam. I have no idea when this wooden beam was put there because it was not there in 1947. But the staining makes it appear as though there is always something wooden there, and there are notches on the other side to hold it. It's often wondered why the ancients closed one portcullis but not the other. Personally, I find it most likely that this portcullis was not purposely left open, but the builders were simply not able to release it. The pyramid seems to have settled and squeezed the stone, locking it in place. This bug may be why we didn't see this kind of portcullis again for a few hundred years. Further evidence for this can be found behind it. It does seem to have slid a few inches, as I assume the corner is supposed to be resting against this backing stone. Also, why does the backing stone have a hole drilled into it? It's not present in the other one. Finally, at the end of the corridor, we enter the upper chamber, which for some reason has a slant as though the stone here was meant to receive an ascending corridor instead of a straight one. If you're hoping to an end to the claustrophobia of this pyramid and enter a big open room, you're in for a disappointment. While the chamber itself does in fact open up, it is not an open space. The wall on the left side is the wall of the chamber, but the wall on the right side is something else. It's a giant massif built in the chamber. You can see the clean, straight interface where they meet. These Asita project members are looking into a short excavation into the massif that does not fully penetrate it. In my Red Pyramid video, where I proposed fire had been used to dig out the floor, a number of comments wondered if fire could even burn long enough to cut stone that far underground. The robbers' excavation here clearly shows they were using fire to cut stones. The floor has also been dug up right in front of the excavation, which revealed an upside-down cartouche of Snefru, although it has since faded to become almost invisible. There has been some confusion as to exactly where it is, but it's on the east side of the step down where the floor is removed, not inside the excavation. In the same location, there is yet another excavation going in the opposite direction, out of the chamber. Here you can see how deep the removal of the floor goes, and the start of the excavation. It seems they stopped when they hit a particularly hard stone called quartzite, which is the red bit. It's unclear to me if this is masonry made of quartzite or part of the bedrock. The true floor of the chamber should be very close to the bedrock layer. I think it likely the robbers chose to dig here because Snefru's cartouche is not the only worker's mark here. This one is located right above the excavation, and I suppose an ancient robber could interpret it as a reference marker for a tunnel beyond. We can see that the massif sections off the space and we must climb over it to get to the other side. It's likely a staircase once went from the floor to the top of the structure, but this loose rubble that remained there in 1947 is likely a later job. These stones were removed and a ladder is now used to climb to the top. There seem to be two separate constructions for the massif. You will see two locations for a floor or ceiling, depending on your perspective, on the other side, as well as this lip towards the entrance. There is also this strange part here that seems to be part of the massif. It seems most likely that this once had a solid L-shaped construction, and the northeast corner was excavated down through by robbers. These pictures were taken from a small platform on the first layer of construction on that L section. Above it, it appears like a ceiling once covered it, as there are the remains of paving stones overhanging it. Like I mentioned, in the northeast corner, the massif has been removed and has been excavated all the way down to the true floor, but they seem to have gone no further. Oddly, there does appear to be a robber's hole leading north, just below what seems to be the second set of paving stones. If you're wondering about the black specks everywhere, it's bat guano. This excavation was only dug a few feet and seems to merely be probing for nearby chambers. When Paring explored the top of the massif in 1839, there was an enormous amount of debris piled up here along the southwest side. This is a photo from 1947 where the piles still exist, and the question must be asked, where did it all come from? Some of it may have fallen from the damaged ceiling, but not that much. I suppose it most likely came from digging into the massif to the floor in the northeast corner. Interestingly, we can see that the entranceway did in fact have a ceiling on it, which you can partially see here. It's been suggested that the square hole next to it may have been for a canopic chest, but it looks like an excavation to me. It is directly above the attempted excavation through the massif. It might even be Hussein's work, as Paring does not draw it. I noticed a mystery here. See these 4 log holes in the image on the right from 1947? Well, on the left are the same holes from the Asita project. You can see that the ceiling paving stone has been removed, but also, why did someone plaster a beam into one of those holes? Considering we're about to look at a bunch more beams, this is annoying that Egyptologists are putting things where they didn't originally go. Before we examine what's under the floor, let's look up at the corbelled ceiling. Like the chamber below, all 4 faces move inwards for each corbel, but you can also see the amount of destruction that this ceiling has gone through. Most likely from salt damage, but close to the camera, I see chisel marks, indicating that some of this was done by workers. I mentioned it seemed that the Meidun upper chamber also seemed to have purposeful cutting of the corbels. I'm not the only one to notice this. It appears like the intent was to make the ceiling smooth. It seemed like a phase in between corbelled ceilings and the chevron vaulted ceilings of his son's pyramid, though they actually seemed to be trying to make a rounded cone. When Fakhri started removing the upper floor, he began to see cedar beams and then fully excavated the space below, giving us this. The floor of this image is the true floor of the chamber, so what is the purpose of raising the floor up not once but seemingly twice? It seems like a hollow space was created, then a ceiling was placed over it, resting on wooden beams that for some reason are notched into other logs as opposed to embedded into walls like everywhere else. You can clearly see how these paving stones rested upon and were plastered to these beams. For some reason, both floors have 2 sets of crossbeams. For the upper floor, only the lower ones remain. The floor would actually have been supported by logs inserted into these holes. So what did the lower set do? Interestingly, the log holes in the upper chamber appear to have been excavated, where the ones in the lower chamber appear built in. This indicates that maybe this entire massive thing was not original. In the right image, if you look closely, you can see chisel marks going from left to right inside the hole. This is in the lower section. This would not be possible if this block was already in place. On the left image, you see a stone chiseled away and even leaving some bits and pieces of it stuck to the block next to it. This is from the upper section. The reason Egyptologists believe that the entire structure in the chamber is original is because many of the chips removed from the upper section by Fakhri had worker marks that mention Snefru. I find this unsatisfying and wish we had these original blocks. We know Snefru's cult existed for almost 1,000 years, and this place was called Snefru's Pyramid by later kingdoms. If writing related to Snefru is all they're basing this assumption on, that'd be like assuming this wall in Queens is 2,000 years old because it mentions Jesus. This concludes our tour of the Bent Pyramid and rounds out the projects of Snefru. Obviously, this was merely an overview of one of the most confusing monuments, and I intend to revisit some of the more mysterious features in the future. Thank you for listening. Comment your thoughts or mention specific features you'd like me to deep dive into below, and subscribe to continue to explore the enigmas of our distant ancestors with me.